Hello and welcome to Game 6 in the 2024 World Chess Championship. A fierce game here in the sixth round. Now we have Ding Liren, the world champion, 32 years old, from China, playing the youngest world champion challenger in history, Gukesh Damaraju from India. And the game begins with d4, little more strategic opening than the e4 possibilities, where the game opens up more usually. So the game continues with knight to f6, kind of a waiting move to see what the opponent will do, and bishop to f4. All right, it looks like we could be heading into some type of London system. So let's check this out. d5. So this equalizes things in the center as far as the pawns go. And now e3. So an accelerated London system. There are a few different ways to play the London system. You could bring the knight out before bringing the bishop. Sometimes you would play knight to c3, the Jabava London system. The regular London system, you might bring the knight here along with this knight here, so the one knight backs the other one up. All right, so the game continues with e6, solidifying the pawn in the center here. And we continue with knight to f3, helping control the center. Maybe a possibility of jumping forward here at some point. And c5, a common break, pawn break here in the London system, where this strong central d4 pawn is attacked by the less valuable flank pawn. So the world champion just fortifies that pawn. And this is a little bit different than the Jabava London system, where often the knight is placed in front of this pawn instead of moving the knight here. But in the regular London system, you can play c3 to help fortify the center. So the game continues with the bishops fighting for control of this diagonal, and let's see how it continues. Development by the world champion, bringing the other bishop out, and we have a check on the board, and the knight blocks. So the computer says this is the best move, and at this point in the opening, it looks like white has a slight edge. So the game continues with a capture here. The computer recommended just castling, but immediately we have this capture of the knight, and the bishop pair is lost by white. So generally you don't want to give up the bishop pair unless you have a good reason. And here it looks like the bishop pair is given up to wreck the pawns on the queen side. Now we have doubled pawns here, an isolated pawn here, and these could be endgame weaknesses as the game progresses. So we continue with another exchange of bishops here. A exchange of bishops. And now a general guideline is that if you lose your bishop pair and your opponent has their bishop pair, it's usually good to try and knock out their bishop pair, even if you have to give up your last remaining bishop here. So both sides lose their bishop pair. The queen recaptures with development here. And now we have an interesting move. The computer says this is an excellent move, but once again, castling king side is recommended, and it looks like the queen lines up on the king here. That can be a good strategy of lining up on more valuable pieces, or the king. And now we have castling to the king side. Now, you would think that white would go ahead and castle as well, but white holds off on that, dropping the queen back and adding pressure on this pawn along with the central pawn. So there's a possibility of knocking out this pawn, and how should the young challenger defend this pawn? Well, let's see what happens. You can't push the pawn forward because it's pinned to the queen here. So this knight will probably have to figure out a way to help protect this pawn. So Gukesh decides to jump the knight forward instead of dropping it back to defend the pawn. So the knight grabs this outpost. Generally, that's a good principle to follow. Try and place your knights on a good outpost square where it's harder to chase away, where either no pawns can attack it, or because this knight is in the way of this pawn, it would take a little while to get rid of this knight. So the game continues with knight dropping back, attacking this centralized knight on the outpost. And if the knight captures, well, that would just help the other knight develop. So let's see what Gukesh does here. He ignores the attack of his knight and pushes this pawn in the center. And according to the computer, black has a slight edge here, depending on what white does. Let's see here. Knights are exchanged after recapturing. Now, black is left with doubled pawns on the e file, doubled pawns on the c file, and this isolated pawn. So, how will the game commence here? How will things continue? We have a queen capture. So with that capture, Ding Liren goes ahead by a pawn and threatens to exchange off queens. Now, generally, if you're ahead in material, even one pawn, it can be a good idea to exchange off pieces. Whereas if you are behind by a pawn or by material, you want to try and trade off as many pawns as you can, but keep the pieces on the board to keep your chances alive. So Gukesh plays the best move here, a great move, retreating that queen, allowing the possibility of white capturing with the queen or with the pawn here, and Gukesh counterattacks, threatening to attack this pawn. If the world champion castles here to the king side, well then, after this castling move, it would allow something like this. That would be a blunder, because then you have this possibility here. The queen is pinning this. There's a threat of a mate here, and you would have to block by pushing the pawn forward. Then the bishop could pick off the more valuable rook. So in the game, if we go back, after the queen attacks this pawn, the world champion ignores that in favor of development. And according to the computer, that's the right choice. You bring the knight off the back rank, get closer to developing all your pieces. Now there's the option to castle on the queen side, and this knight attacks this valuable central pawn, but for the moment it's guarded by the queen. So there's also many threats here. White could attack this pawn. This pawn is under attack. So now Gukesh jumps forward, capturing a pawn, attacking the rook here, threatening a check. The king would have to move, and then the other rook would be under fire. So how does the world champion take care of this problem? Well, he plays the best move here, a great move according to the computer, where you just castle queen side. The rooks are backing each other up here and working in tandem. And also, this pawn is just left unprotected here. So what does Gukesh do? He snaps up the pawn, and now the world champion grabs a pawn in the center and also does not capture with the queen, because now after the capture with this pawn, white's queen can guard this central pawn here. So the game continues with rook lining up on this vulnerable square that is only, or vulnerable pawn on this square on b2 that is only protected by the king. So, this knight cannot grab this pawn, or else the queen would deliver a checkmate here. So the game continues with knight jumping forward here, protecting the pawn, and now we have the bishop developing as well. So at this point, all the pieces are pretty much developed, except for maybe this rook on f8 for black and this other rook here, although it's guarding this pawn from the queen at the moment. So the game continues with a rook attack on the queen, which helps guard this pawn, relieving this other rook of guard duty. And so now the queen retreats, keeping an eye on this pawn, protecting this pawn. And so the game continues with rook moving to the center, protecting the pawn. And now the young challenger decides to exchange off the knight and bishop here. So after queen captures, there is a possible threat. Once again, the queen is eyeing this pawn, although the queen is protecting that. But perhaps a rook could jump in here at the moment, at some point, adding pressure. So here we have an inaccuracy played by Gukesh. Apparently, rook at b to d8 would have been better, fighting for this open file in the center. But perhaps Gukesh did not want to trade off rooks. He wanted to keep the rooks and the queen on the board to still have some chances of winning instead of going into a more drawish endgame as more and more pieces are exchanged off the board. So the queen snaps up another pawn, and the world champion goes ahead in material here. So after a capture by black's queen, material is equalized, and the world champion centralizes his queen while attacking this enemy queen, asking Gukesh, do you want to exchange queens off the board? So the young challenger refuses that, does not exchange queens. He wants to keep the game alive, keeping queens on the board. That gives you a lot more possibilities and maybe some chances here. So once again, the world champion attacks the queen, putting the question to Gukesh. Do you want to trade or not? Now, according to the computer, it would have been better to double the rooks up and just try and take control of this open D file. But we have a conflict amongst the queens here. And once again, the young challenger sidesteps, avoids the exchange. And now the game continues with centralization once again. Queen attacking queen. This pawn is under attack. So the game continues with the queen just dropping back, and this is the best move according to the computer. Material is even, but at this point, with centralized queen and queen rook battery, applying pressure to down this half open D file, white has an edge here by the equivalent of half a pawn. So queen attacks again, and once again the computer prefers the doubling of the rooks. Then you would have a tripling on the D file, and that's a pretty strong battery there of two rooks and queen. Generally you would want the rooks in the lead maybe, with the queen behind. That way the rooks could move forward, especially attacking the queen. So now we have, once again, retreat, queen attacks the pawn and the queen. So will we have a repetition of position? No. Gukesh avoids the draw by repeating the position 3 times, and he retreats the queen, defending his pawn, eyeing the enemy pawn. So what happens next here? Well, finally, the world champion, he goes ahead and triples up on this open D file. So Gukesh finds the best move, pushing a pawn forward, giving his king a little bit of breathing room here. And the game continues with the queen grabbing this diagonal. So this is an important strategy. If you have a fianchettoed position and the bishop is no longer in that diagonal to guard, you either want your queen to move here, not now, of course, or it would be captured. But this is probably why the world champion moved his queen here, to grab this diagonal, get out of the way of the rooks here, and of preventing black's queen from grabbing the diagonal. And this pawn is under pressure, although it's guarded for the moment. So the game continues with the rook attacking the queen. Queen retreat, attacking once again, and now we have the queen stepping back. From here, the queen, has a little bit more mobility. It also keeps an eye on this rook. It keeps an eye on the pawn. So let's see what happens here. The queen steps forward, and now we have the queen shooting over to the A file, putting pressure on this pawn, which is unprotected for the moment, and A3, the best move in the position. And so now we have the queen to B5, and according to the computer, this is best, but white has slowly built up a little bit of an edge here by 0.73, even though material is even. White does have this pawn majority on the queen side, which could be dangerous in an endgame. Now, black, of course, has a pawn majority over on the king side. So, the game continues with the rook centralizing, adding more pressure to the pawn along with the queen. And now we have queen to E2, an inaccuracy. And the game has jumped to +1. 0.06, so about the equivalent of a pawn's advantage. And now the rook attacks the queen, chasing the queen, trying to get it off of the back rank here, because if the rook would have captured, rook captures, queen captures, this pawn here would no longer be protected, and black could go ahead and pick that off, and then maybe move this pawn, get his H pawn rolling in the endgame. So finally, Gukesh attacks his opponent's queen and asks, now do you want to trade queens? So what does the world champion do? He avoids the trade here because I guess that could have, if he would have captured, and the pawn recaptures, it would be a little bit of an easier target for this pawn. He'd have a passed pawn, although, I don't know, maybe the rook could immediately get behind the passed pawn and pick it off. But that doesn't matter now because we have the king stepping forward, an inaccuracy. Apparently, queen to G5 is the preferred move by the computer. But in the game, after the the king has moved forward, and remember, it's always wise to get your king activated in the endgame, especially as more and more pieces come off the board. You want that king to help with the offense and the defense, and especially once these queens are traded off, now the kings will make all the more difference in the game. So queens are exchanged. We have f5, a nice secure pawn chain here. The passed pawn is protected here, and the game continues with h4. I believe this is the first mistake of the game made by the world champion, and the game swings back to half a pawn equivalent advantage for the young challenger Gukesh now. So, what would have been better here? Computer recommends rook to g2, just lining up on the king, pinning this pawn here on g6, and then maybe it would be a good idea to start pushing this pawn forward, maybe trying to come all the way up here and apply pressure, attack. So the game continues with this h4 mistake, and does Gukesh find a way to take advantage of it? No, he missed an opportunity here. And after e3, trying to get this passed pawn moving and attacking the rook, an opportunity was missed here. So apparently, according to the computer, and sometimes these world-class players play at such a high level that they may have a plan that the computer did not anticipate. But according to the computer, the best move here would be king to g7. And, it just helps activate the king a little bit more. And also, once you push this passed pawn forward, it's going to be less secure because a pawn cannot protect it anymore, only the rook. So the game continues with this h4 move. Pawn pushes forward, attacking the rook. The rook blockades the passed pawn. And so rook moves up, protecting this pawn, protecting this pawn, maybe getting ready to double rooks and help fortify this pawn. But, there's a possibility of dropping back, doubling rooks, and then getting the king involved, maybe. But if the king would try and move here, there is always a possibility of a rook checking the king back. So, it would be hard to go after this pawn with two rooks and the king, because the king could be chased away. Although, the king could try and head down here and swing around to the other side and go after this pawn with the rooks doubled up here on the e file. So, that's a possibility as well. But in the game, let's see what happens. So if I step back, we have rook to e7. The king moves forward, trying to apply pressure to the pawn. But this is another mistake. According to the computer, it would have been better to play, c4 here. And that way white begins to start pushing his passed pawn, and maybe push b4, c5, and get this pawn majority rolling on the queen side. But in the game, we had this move, king to d3. King and rook pile up on the pawn. So the rooks double up, protecting the pawn. And now we have this h5 move. Okay, so here it looks like you're just giving up a pawn. Beginners might think, why would you do that? Well, if this pawn captures, well, that kind of wrecks the pawns on the king side here, leaving doubled pawns on the h-file, doubled isolated pawns, and an isolated pawn here on f5. And so it kind of weakens the king side. And so, if black does not capture, you could just go ahead and capture and exchange off a pawn here, getting rid of your weak isolated h-pawn. So black does capture here. kind of weakening his pawns. According to the computer, it would have been better just to play king to f6. That way, if white would have captured on g6 here, pawn could have recaptured, and the king would be on f7 guarding that backwards pawn. And so the game continues with rook stepping up, attacking this unprotected pawn, and now we have a passed pawn pushing forward on h4. So after capture, white things have equalized here now as far as pawns, and now it's kind of an interesting position in this endgame. Black has doubled isolated pawns, but the rook could possibly just move in behind the passed pawn. Generally a good strategy, getting behind passed pawns, and pick that off. So how does the game continue? We have rook to d7 check. The king steps back here, and the computer says this is a great move, but where else could the king go? If he went forward, then the rooks would start harassing the king. So the king just steps back to safety. So now we have king moving up to g7, rook checks, and the king steps back here. According to the computer, this is a great move. The king probably does not want to move up here. The king should not have moved forward. That could cause problems, leading to a draw, maybe checking back and forth with the rook while this rook traps the king on the edge. So because of that, the king retreated back to h8. So now we have the rook blockading this passed pawn, and the king steps back out. So after check, king retreats, rook blockades the passed pawn, king steps out, and another draw. So some fierce fighting, throughout the game. Both sides were trying to, get some type of advantage. The young challenger avoided queen trades there in the middle game or towards the end game. And, then we just went into rook end games, which, they can be more drawish. But, once again, the players kept both rooks on the board. If you exchange off one pair of these rooks, then it would be much more drawish. But, keeping both rooks on the board does keep things a little more lively. So a draw after repetition on the board, repetition of position 3 times. Now, I used to pull up this game review at the beginning of the game, but a good point was made by one of the viewers that I shouldn't give away the game result right at the beginning, which that makes sense. So I do this afterwards. The chart here says that it was, computer says it was a nice even game. And according to this, it looks like it's pretty steady the whole way through. White did have a little bit of an edge in the middle game until it fizzled out into a dead even end game. So the world champion played at 96.3% accuracy. The challenger, 96.2% accuracy. So very high level chess here. Quite accurate. Although there were a few little hiccups, a few moves that could have maybe been better according to the computer. But we have 5 great moves by the world champion, 4 great moves by the challenger. And as far as bad moves, both players had 4 inaccuracies, but the world champion had 2 mistakes according to the computer and 1 missed opportunity by the challenger. But no blunders. And the world champion played at a 2900 level. The challenger played at a 2950 level. And accuracy in the opening 99.9 in the opening for the world champion, 100% accuracy in the opening for the challenger. And then the middle game, 96.1% accuracy for Ding Liren. And the young challenger, Gukesh, played 95.5% accuracy. And I noticed that the challenger, he seems to play well in the opening and the end game, but he maybe lags behind a little bit in the middle game. So, we'll have to see how that plays out, as the match continues. So the end game, 94.6% accuracy for the champion and 95.6% accuracy for the young challenger. And that's what I mentioned. It seems like maybe Gukesh plays the end game just a little bit better than the world champion, but the middle game has been a little more accurate for the world champion than the challenger. All right. Well, feel free to leave any comments. As always, I'm interested to hear in anything that you have to say out there. Also, please like and subscribe to support the channel if you haven't already. Thank you for watching and have a super chess day.